Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Resumes from Scratch. My name is Talia Hoffman. I'm the training coordinator here at CWD, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Lori Stickles is our instructor. She'll be walking you through today. Just to let you know, if you haven't, please be sure to enter your full first and last name in our poll to receive credit for attending. And you can, of course, enter questions in the chat box at any time, just so you know they are only visible to me and Lori. So I think we're going to get started today.
Great. So as Talia said, I'm Lori, and I'm a facilitator here at the center, and I do a lot of work in our career development arena. And we wanted to put together this webinar called Resumes from Scratch. So let's go to the next slide and look at what do we mean by scratch? Well, we're really going to be covering very basic material. We're going to be providing a skeleton, an outline for how to get the required information on the page, and then we're going to talk about how you can tailor that information. So whether you already have a resume that you're using, or you have a very old resume, or you can't find your resume at all, I hope you'll kind of take our guidelines and tailor them to your own situation. You all have different needs and uses for this resume, and with that there's going to be some exceptions to some of the things I mentioned about resume writing. To that end, we do encourage you to try to attend an in-person resume writing workshop if possible, so you can really fine-tune and focus on the content piece, which we're not going to have the opportunity to dive into that much. So let's talk about the agenda. We're going to address required sections for your resume, and with that, what not to put on the resume that's going to make your resume appear out of it or outdated. We're going to talk about the blank page syndrome, and I'm sure you all know what that means. We're going to talk about what to do with your old resume, whether it's 10 years old or a year old. We're going to address the optional sections that you may want to choose from to enhance your resume. And finally, we're going to end with some resources that are available to you. Now, do notice that we're going to be talking about resumes for the United States. We're not going to be talking about resumes that you might use for international jobs, and those do have some variations. And in addition, we're not going to be talking about CVs. Those are academic documents, and we're sticking just with frameworks for administrative resumes. So let's look at the required sections for your resume. And if you're sitting there with your resume right now, either in front of you or perhaps on the split computer screen or something, you want to look for these required sections. Obviously the heading, the top, the experience section, which is about your skills, what it is that you know how to do, and of course where you did that, your history, and then finally your education, which is about your knowledge base. What are you bringing to the job in terms of your knowledge experience? That's it in terms of requirements on the resume. So let's quickly look at the elements of the heading. You'll notice that we've got the heading right in the middle of the page. It's centered with your name, your address, etc. This is what a lot of the scanning software, the systems like Aspire, which we use here at Harvard, they read across the top of the document looking to pick up the information in this particular order. And that's why we're suggesting that you use this order. Also, your eyes always go to the top of the page and sort of zero in on a center point naturally. So this is why you want to grab people's attention right away with a good, strong heading. What do you not include in the heading? You don't want to have labels like you'll see name in red, Betty Edwards, address. That makes it feel like a form. You don't want your resume to feel like an employment form, which you may in fact be filling out at another point, but you want to leave off those headings. They used to be on resumes a long time ago and not anymore. In addition, you don't want to get all kind of fancy and be writing out state names like Massachusetts. Even though that looks really nice and formal, truthfully, you just want to go with the abbreviations, MA, RI. Also, you want to be careful not to include a secondary address That's very confusing for the reader, and even though that might be tempting, if in fact you have a secondary address, really try to resist the temptation to do that. And you also don't want to put your name at the very top and then kind of have some fancy version of the rest of your contact information down the side or on the bottom. It might look really great from a stylistic point of view, but the scanner is not going to be able to pick up your contact information, and that can be really frustrating for the recruiter. So let's look at an example. Now, this is Betty Edwards, and you're going to be seeing a lot of Betty Edwards, and this is, of course, a fictional person, but her resume as we go through some examples. This is, I think, a really straightforward heading. Sometimes it is helpful when you've got a telephone number to put in parens, if this is a cell number, if this is a work number, just so the person reading it knows where they might be contacting you. And you want to be careful, of course, that you've got an email address that sounds professional and not like Sparkly Plenty or Hot Mom or something like that. That's just really does not look professional at all. So let's look at the additional required sections. You want your experience. Again, as I mentioned, that's the skill piece. What is it that you know how to do? And your education, your knowledge base. Where did you get your knowledge? And definitely recruiters and hiring managers at Harvard are going to be looking for these sections. Now, the question often comes up, what order do I put them in? Education first, experience first. The big question here on the slide, which order will be more effective? What does the hiring manager expect to see? That's your decision. So typically, your work experience is going to trump your education. That's what people are going to be paying you for, what you know how to do. However, there are some situations where if it's a new degree, you just got a new master's, you've just got a degree that's really paramount to the job, you might choose to put your education first. So let's talk about the experience section. If you're putting your experience section out there, then comes the question, well, what order do I put my information in? This first example, we see that Betty is leading with her place of employment, her employer, Harvard University, and then the title of her job and the department name. And underneath that, you'd have the description of the job. This is one way to organize your information under experience. Let's look at the next example, and Betty has switched this around. You'll notice now she's leading with the title of her position and then her employer, Harvard University. Once you decide what order you're going to put your information in, it does need to be consistent. So she's going to lead with the title Administrative Coordinator for her Harvard job. For her job with the jewelry store, same thing. She'd want to lead with the title and then with the place of employment. Again, the question often comes up, well, how do I know which order to put it in? Purely up to you. What do you want to be advertising? Remember, we're just going to get our first impression based on what you put on the page. So whatever's on the page first, we're going to start thinking, oh, she works at Harvard University. If you put your title first, oh, she is the owner of this store. So you want to think about what do you want that impression to be of the person who's reading this. In terms of dates, again, you can put, typically dates are over on the far right. I have seen dates on the left. It depends on your preference. And one thing I want to say about templates, which can be really helpful for people, there's Microsoft templates that you can use to get you started with your resume, but they don't give you the flexibility to think about where do I want to put my title, my employer, because you're just going to be pouring things into a template. And honestly, the template may not present things in the way that's most advantageous for you. So just a word to consider if you're thinking about using a template for your resume. Now, let's look at the education section. So here we've got a sample using Betty's resume of her education, and you'll notice it's very straightforward. Abbreviate your degree, BS, MA, if you want to do it reverse Latin as we do at Harvard, AM, that's fine. But where you got the degree, if you want to include the major, she includes business administration, that's fine. You don't have to include the major, particularly if it's something that you're no longer using, for example. And then you've got she's got a date in there, anticipated date of completion. University of Massachusetts, notice that there's information here about dates and that when she completed this information. You don't necessarily have to put that in there. You often only will see people putting the institution that they actually graduated from with their degree. So the University of Massachusetts is optional if you want to use it. And then we've got some information about additional training that she's gotten at the North Bennett School. So you do not want to include things like GPAs, your SAT scores, whether or not you were on the dean's list. You don't want to fill it up with tons of courses that you took. Only coursework if it's really, really relevant, but typically it's not. And the statistics and the GPA, it's really not relevant in the world of work. Sorry for those of you who are 4.0. It's just not as helpful. So let's switch gears a little bit. A lot of people will say to me, well, I don't even know where to get started. This is even if they have a resume that they've been using, but they feel it needs to be revamped or reworked. They'll say, I have a blank page syndrome going on. How do I begin? So our advice is to just get started with a framework, which we've already done a little bit when we're looking at experience, kind of get a draft going, get down the facts, the easy stuff. Where did you work? When did you work? What was the name of your department? What was your title? Sometimes people will say, well, I can't remember. If that's the case, you may have to do some research. And you want to remind yourself that this is a draft. So you'll see that word draft. It's going to come up on the next several slides. You have to keep reminding yourself that you're creating a draft from which you're going to be choosing information for your resume document. So let's move along about getting into the draft a little bit more. You really want to be thinking about, what do I want to get down that was specific to each of the jobs? So it's going to appear a little bit unwieldy. There's going to be a lot of information. We're really talking about what I term a data dump for each job that you've had, and really giving yourself the freedom to think about what it is that you did without the pressure of getting it down to 1 to 2 pages on the resume. So let's see what you might consider saying about each job. First thing, you want to say too much. And again, this can be really difficult to get your head around when you know that the final document has got to be no more than 2 pages. So at the draft stage, you want to throw in everything you can. Answer these questions. These are called the journalism questions. We all know them. Who, what, where, when, how many, whom was involved, why were you doing it? So for the different tasks that you had in your positions, you really want to be answering all these questions on your big, messy draft. Now, the final point here, on the resume itself, remember, you're going to be choosing the best parts of the draft information to move into the resume. So just keep reminding yourself, there's the draft and the resume are 2 different things. So the current job can be really hard to write about, and because you don't have the same perspective that you have on previous jobs, so you want to give yourself a fair amount of time to really be thinking about the current job. And sometimes people need help. They need somebody else to do a little interview with them about the current job so that they can get to some of those important questions. So how old a job is too old? This is a question that I get asked a lot of times. So let's look at the guidelines here. Focus on the last 10 years. Focus on the last 10 years. And of course, you're including your current job in that. The reason for this is because employers really care about what you've been doing recently, what skills you've been using, what training you've had, what courses you've taken. So they're really focusing on the past 10 years. This does not mean that your work experience prior to 10 years is any less important. You are going to be creating that and putting all of that on your big messy draft too. You're just going to want to be really mindful when you're pulling information from the past into the current day. How am I going to be talking about this in a way that's relevant? So we're still drafting. As we're looking at this big messy draft, many people will say, well, what is the point of all of this information? It's way too much for my resume. Well, yes, and it's a really good place to go to get additional information for your cover letters, to prepare for interviews, both job interviews, informational interviews. You may find it's a good place to even get information for thank you notes if you're lucky enough to have interviews. That's great. Remember with the draft, length is not a problem. It can go on indefinitely. And you're always going to want a place where you can go and drop in things that you've done, whether it's a course or you had a networking meeting with somebody. As long as you've got that big messy draft, you have a place to go and put it. Now let's talk about shaping the draft a little bit. One way to shape all of this information is to really study what job descriptions are asking for. So looking at the keywords, those are usually nouns, and they describe everything from technical skills to degrees to certifications to languages. So you want to look for those. You want to look for how they're describing skills, how are they talking about the requirements of the job. So you really want to be looking at those key phrases and pulling them out so that when you go to look at your resume and how you're building it, you're choosing the best words based on the jobs that you're looking for. So to review, again, the required sections of the resume, your heading, your experience, and your education. And now we just talked a little bit about how you take a deep dive into creating this big messy draft so that you have a lot of information to draw from. And let's get back to some of the optional sections because these can be really interesting. These are all optional, and you would want to consider using these only if they're going to be useful to you based on the kind of work that you're looking for. So let's just go down the list very quickly. Tailored skill summary, related skills, technical skills, which could include software certification, that type of thing, volunteer work, languages, professional organizations, and your memberships, and possibly other things that come up that you may want to put on the resume. All right, skill summary is really a helpful tool. So we're going to spend a fair amount of time now talking about the skill summary. So let's look at the top of this slide. This is, again, our friend Betty Edwards, and she's going to be applying for a job, and this phrasing is from that job description. And this is a skill summary that she would use potentially to fit in with that specific job. Now, let's take a minute to look at Betty's full resume here. So Talia's just going to pull that up. Now, this is Betty's resume. This is her original skill summary. Let's look at this. She's got a lot of information here, too many items. She's got a lot going on. If you're going to use a tailored skill summary, the point is it should be the icing on the cake for somebody. It should say, look, these are the top 3 to 5 skills that I know your job is looking for. If you have a skill summary that's too large, then the person reading is like, I don't really get the difference between a skill summary and the list of professional experience. They become the same thing. So based on the job that Betty is going for, she really is going to want a skill summary that's very targeted towards the language, towards her experience in that particular field. So let's go back to that slide. And hopefully you can see now that she's really choosing the skills that speak to the fluency, the supervisory experience, and the cultural sensitivity. So I think the next slide, the next resume have a skill summary that looks quite different. So the point of this is that the skill summaries, if they're short and tailored, you can swap them in and out. You might have a section on your big messy draft entitled skill summaries where you'll have different skill summaries ready to go based on the kinds of jobs that you're looking for. So here's another example for Betty. This is a different type of job, so she's pulled together a different skill summary. This skill summary, you'll notice, does not mention her bilingual skills in Spanish. One would assume that that job didn't ask for it. And she's really emphasizing different pieces of skills in this skill summary. So again, the skill summary is typically the last thing that you start to tailor after you've got your big messy draft and you're really looking at specific jobs. You want to ask yourself, what skill summary might I want to put on top of this resume? All right, so the optional sections also around professional development. You'll notice that the word relevant is prominent. It's right in front of this. When you're going to have a professional development section, you really want to make sure that it's going to be relevant. So let's look at a possible example. Here we've got professional development, somebody who's taken a Foundation of Leadership course, CWD. They completed it in 2012. And you would include that if the type of jobs that you're applying for are really looking for people who are taking advantage of coursework that gets at leadership skills, self-awareness skills, negotiation skills, the types of coursework that's covered in Foundations of Leadership. Also, you want to make sure these are recent. I usually suggest for a course like this, it needs to be within the past 3 years or so to be considered recent and relevant because things change so much. So certainly 2012 is well within that. Okay, so let's look at volunteer experience. A lot of people undervalue their volunteer experience. And I just want to say that if you've got volunteer experience that really addresses specific skills, it could be anything from organizational skills to money management to presentation skills, please consider putting that on the resume if it's relevant to the kinds of jobs that you're looking for, and also recent. So if you volunteered for something 20 years ago, that's probably not going to cut it on the resume. Technical skills. Now this is an interesting category because you can in fact include your technical skills in that skill summary section that we just talked about if they're really going to be critical to the job. So you're going into a job, you absolutely have to have specific software skills, they have to be at a high level, or you've got science-related bench researcher skills or certifications in particular engineering areas, etc. You might want to get them right at the top of that page in a skill summary. If not, I do think it's helpful to have a technical skills section on the resume that's short, that speaks to your specific software skills, and again, any other technical skill training that you had. Let's look at languages. Again, the thing with languages is you can include that in the skill summary as Betty Edwards did. She put her fluency in Spanish in the skill summary, or some people, particularly if you've got multiple languages and it's going to be relevant to the job, you can include that in its own section. Here's what I want to say about languages. In my opinion, only put languages that you are proficient in. I don't think it's that helpful, neither do hiring managers, to put things like knowledge of French, knowledge of Spanish. What does that mean, really? And by proficient, I mean you'd be able to get along in a small dialogue with somebody, or you could write something in that language. That's just my advice around languages. Professional organizations and memberships. Again, they have to be relevant, they have to make sense, and if you put it on the resume you have to be prepared to talk about it and talk about perhaps the last meeting you went to, what you took away from a presentation. I mean, if you're just slapping professional organizations on your resume and you're not actually involved, it could backfire in an interview. So just something to consider. I also think it can be a great networking tool. If you put a professional organization or membership, somebody may ask you about it, and then you can talk about how you met or you heard a particular speaker, and that really just demonstrates your breadth of knowledge outside of your current workplace. So that can be really helpful. Objective. Boy, there was a day not too long ago when all resumes had an objective. That actually was a really long time ago. We are not seeing very many objectives on resumes. They tend to not be particularly helpful unless you're making a very significant professional change in your work, or you're returning to work after an absence, or you have a new degree that's really pivotal to the kind of job that you're applying for. It's going to help orient the reader if that's the case. But otherwise, vague general objectives like, I'm looking for meaningful work, that's not helpful. Hopefully we're all looking for meaningful work. I would not use an objective in that case. All right, so more on what not to include. I'm sure this is review for everyone, but in case it's not, let's just talk about the fact that in the United States we don't use photos for resumes. I know some countries do use them, but we don't, unless, of course, it's a theater resume. But that would be exciting if any of you had a theater resume. References do not go directly on the resume. And in fact, you would only provide references once they have asked you for them. And that's typically going to be in the form of a separate sheet of paper or an email with your references listed. No personal information. Again, this used to be standard back in the 80s, even 70s or 80s, but you don't want to have any of your personal information, and certainly never put your Social Security number out there on any kind of information, even an application. So what if you think you need more than one resume, which is very common, by the way. We have a lot of people who've got interests in different areas of work. You do need to create 2 different resumes if that's the case, and really do research on both fields independently. Think about what's going to make sense for the reader, because it's possible that the audience for 2 different types of work are going to have different interests in mind. So say you're interested in interior design, but you also have an experience as a financial analyst. Those are 2 very different resumes and should be treated as 2 very different fields of work. I would not try to combine the 2 unless, for some reason, that made sense. And as I said, you're going to really have to tailor this information based on your own experience. So let's go into some truths about resumes. You're always going to have that draft going. I want you to think of your big, messy draft as sort of an organic, living, breathing being. You're constantly looking at the draft of information. You're putting things on it. You're taking from it. You're enhancing it as more information comes clear to you about the work that you've done. You're never really going to be done with your resume. And there is no such thing as the perfect resume. If there was, we would all be using that one resume. So you really want to go for good enough. And what do I mean by good enough? Obviously, your resume needs to be professionally written, free of spelling errors, punctuation, grammatical mistakes. You really want it to be reaching the attention of the audience that you have in mind. So whatever you need to do that. And I say to people, your resume is working when you're getting phone calls for the jobs that you want. And it doesn't matter if I like the resume or somebody doesn't like the resume. If you're getting the phone calls, the jobs you want, the resume is working. And I love this next quote. Everyone does have an opinion on religion, politics, and resumes. Honestly, everyone that you show your resume to is going to have a different take on where you should put information, how much you should put on, how it should go on the page. That's just the way it is. You need to keep thinking about what's going to work for me, what kind of feedback am I getting from the resume, and just continue to tweak it along the way. These are our top takeaways. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. There are a couple that I think are particularly important. The first one, of course, is the top third. We talked about how important it is to have your heading be really visible. The first thing that they read on the resume is going to set their impression of who you are. You want to be able to catch the reader's attention. So if you choose to use a skill summary, which remember is an optional piece, that's going to go right up at the top of the resume, and you don't want to waste the space by having a ill-thought-out or general or vague skill summary. You really want to be thoughtful about what specific skills need to go there. You really want to be focusing on the two guiding principles. I will say it again. Your information needs to be relevant, and for many of those optional sections, it needs to be recent. So again, within the last 3 years, maybe 5, depending on what we're talking about, but you don't want to have a lot of old information on there. It's all about what have you done lately. And again, make sure that you're able to talk about everything on your resume in a way that it supports what it is you're trying to do with this job application. So everything is making sense and is cohesive from resume to interviewing section. So what's next? So again, this is just an introduction. This is a from scratch. This is kind of helpful for people who have a resume but feel they really need to pull back and look at the big view of this. It's for those of you who haven't written one in a really long time. I do encourage you to come to an in-person workshop, whether it's at CWD or it's outside. There are a lot of really good resume writing sessions, but you want one where there's going to be open dialogue and an opportunity to really ask questions that are relevant to you. And remember, you are going to hear things undoubtedly different from what I've told you, because we all have a different view on this, and you need to take away what it is that's going to work for you, what makes the most sense for you, and what are you comfortable defending in an interview, because ultimately that's what you're going to be doing with the resume. So Talia, here are our resources for you. We've got resume writing workshop. I happen to know we have one coming up in May. I wish I knew the date of it, but it is coming up sometime in May.
I do know we still have plenty of open seats, so the date is up on Harvey if you want to take a look, and we do encourage everyone to enroll. We would love to see you in person.
That'd be great. Thanks, Talia. These are just some other ideas for online resources. We love the Resume Tutor that the University of Minnesota uses. Quint Careers is one of our favorite, very comprehensive websites for career work. Comprehensive means code for long and involved, but very well organized. And again, lynda.com's online courses on resume writing and also interviewing are very good, and those are available to all of the Harvard employees. So I encourage you to look at those as well. And now I think my favorite part of the presentation, it's time for questions and answers.
We have picked up 1 or 2 questions as the presentation was going on. Don't worry, we will answer them. But this is a great time. We have Lori here, basically as a captive audience to all of you. If you have any questions about resumes, writing resumes, she is our resident career expert guru. So if you want to type anything into the chat at this time, please do. We'll wait just a minute or two just to kind of get everything together. And just so you know, in case you're a little shy, the chat is only visible to me and Lori, not to the group. All right, so enter those in the chat, and we'll be back in 1 second. So just in a quick response, we will be posting this presentation, which includes a recording and all the slides, along with a resources document on Harvey. It'll be on the Watch and Learn page, which when you go to the main Harvey page, there's a link to Watch and Learn right at the bottom left underneath the other options. So we should get that posted, if not this week, early next week, especially I know for that slide with all those resources. Don't worry, it will be up on Harvey on the Watch and Learn page. All right, we're back. We've had a few questions come in. Some are related to, what is the difference between a resume and a CV, and would the suggestions here also apply to CV?
Right. So this is a great question, and we do get this question a lot. Obviously, we're an academic institution, so we have a lot of people with CVs and a lot of people who work on CVs for other people. So the CV is, as I said, an academic document. It is a record in chronological order from oldest to most recent of many of the academic learnings, undertakings of a person. So I'm giving you some general guidelines for that. And if you need a CV, because that's pretty much standard operating procedure if you're in a lab or if you're in an area where you might even have what we call quasi-CV, where it looks like a resume, but there might be an attachment of publications, for example. The resume is different in that it's often in chronological order, but with most recent to past. So they're flipped a little bit, well, they're flipped completely. And the resume is no more than 2 pages, and we know some CVs can go on for hundreds of pages. There is no limit to them. So if you do need a CV, that would probably be for an academic or a quasi-academic position, and they're going to be looking for things like, as I said, publications, possibly research development, research projects that you've been involved on, continuous learning, certifications, that type of thing. There are very different requirements in terms of what different academic areas are looking for with CVs. And I really suggest you go to an academic advisor if you need help fine-tuning your CV.
Yeah, CVs you more see in the academic sphere and not so much in the administrative sphere,
right,
really at all.
Right.
So some other questions we've sort of seen come through, like let's say you've been in the same position for a very long time. Would you be focusing most of your resume on this one position? Would you look at other positions? How would you balance that?
Right. So that's a great question. Because we're trying to think about our professional experience with the last 10 years in mind, some people have been in their position 10+ years. So it's helpful, I think, to kind of chunk it out and look at, well, what have I been doing now going back the last 3 years, and then take a chunk from 3 years to 5 years. And then you'll start to notice patterns of things that you've been doing in work differently. So we've all had to go through upgrades in how we process payments or upgrades in how we plan events, or things have definitely changed for most of us, in other words. And even if they haven't changed that much, many of us have gone through transitions with managers and supervisors and shifts in departments and covering for other people. So you want to look for, in my work experience across this time in the same department, what's changed, what have I learned, what's been different. So you want to be chunking out your work. It is also possible to be thinking about a big chunk of work in terms of skill sections. So you may look at all of your work and say, well, I've been here for 10+ years, and my work falls into these areas: event planning, I'm making this up, of course, event planning, communications, and technical skills. So you're now at least chunking your 10 years of experience into these different categories, and then you can slot in the different duties and responsibilities under each one of those categories. And it's a way to break up that big block of time into more manageable skill summaries for the reader, and also it gives you an opportunity to really highlight accomplishments along the way around things like, as I said, you've had to change up an organizational mission, or you've covered somebody's work, or et cetera. So those are the types of questions that also you could ask in a workshop that's really getting into content more, but it's a great question. So I hope I answered it.
So another thing I think I'm sort of gathering here is, like, let's say you had a break in your work experience or a gap in your resume where maybe for a few years you were doing something else, you were out of the traditional workforce. We have here, you know, family home health care. I was out doing something else that's not traditional work. How would you account for that on a resume, or how would you handle that on a resume?
So there's a couple of ways to handle that. Some people will just literally call it what it was. This includes people who were caring for children, people who were caring for other people at the home, people who were out with their own situations. They'll really call it what it was and say it was for this time period, and then put as much as they want to in terms of describing that work in or out. And usually I'll see that in what's called a straight chronological, so somebody's literally going back, you know, 10 years and saying during this time, I'm making this up, from 2002 to 2006, I was caring for family or whatever. Other people don't want to have that in their chronological listing, so they might do more what's called a functional resume and really put the focus on their skill sets. So they would really just call out their current skill sets and then have what's called a work history at the bottom of that. And that work history is very collapsed, because then you're just saying, I worked here during these days. I worked here during these days. I was, you know, home health care giver or providing child care during these dates. So the work history is not as prominent as it would be in a chronological resume. It just depends on what your feeling is about putting it out there. In my experience with working with the recruiters today, so I used to recruit for the university 10-plus years ago, and at that point it really wasn't seen as a good idea to put something on the resume like I was providing care at home for whatever period. So people were trying to do these functional resumes. Now I find the recruiters are much more accepting. If it's on the page and it's self-explanatory, fine, whatever, they just kind of deal with it and may ask you about it in the interview, but it's really not that big of a deal. I think things have really changed a lot in that area.
And so something else is, someone is asking about including jobs that are beyond those 10 years,
yep,
such as something in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
How would that work? How should it work or not work?
Well, again, you can put it on. It's fine. If anything that you put on your resume is fair game for people to ask you about in an interview. And they may start there. You never know where the interviewer is going to start. They may go to the bottom of your resume, the bottom of your second page, and say, well, tell me about what you were doing in 1997. And presumably they're going to be asking you because they do see it's relevant to the job. Although they could be asking you just to be nosy, but you need to be making the case for how that is relevant to the job that you're applying for.
Yeah, I think if you feel that it's very relevant to a position or to the positions you're applying to, then that would make sense.
Right.
It's just on there because it's on there.
Right.
And that doesn't make so much sense.
Right.
Okay, so someone's asking about experience versus degrees. So let's say you're applying to a position that would say, you know, bachelor's required and X number of years experience, but you as the person applying have an associate's, but maybe a great deal more years of experience than is required.
Mm-hmm. Right, so this is a really good question, and this introduces the whole idea of basic qualifications versus additional qualifications. So I'm going to speak right now about how Harvard job postings are presented. There's a section called basic qualifications in the job posting. Anything that's in the basic qualifications, which could include a degree, like a bachelor's degree, like a master's degree, if it's in basic qualifications, the person hired into the job has to have that qualification or they cannot be hired into that job. It's possible that somebody may decide, well, I don't really think they need the bachelor's degree. If that's the case, they got to pull the job down and repost it without that in basic qualifications. If it's in additional qualifications, then it's not a requirement for the job. And if you've got experience, but not necessarily the degree, then that's fair game. One of the things to keep in mind about where we work is we are in the business of providing degrees and education for people. So sometimes when they say requires a BA, they really mean that. They're really going to want that. Other times, it's not going to be an issue, and you're not really going to know the difference. That's just to help you garner your expectations around that.
And often on job descriptions, you'll see, preferred bachelor's. It's not in those sort of required requirements. It's more we would prefer someone like this, but maybe if you have years of experience that kind of balance that out,
yeah,
that could definitely work.
Right.
So,
right. Remember the thing about longevity in the job, and that this includes me, folks, by the way, too. Longevity in a job, whether it's 10 years, 30 years, whatever, that is not the skill. That's how long you've been in the job. But you really want to be thinking about my skills in the job, what I've learned in the job, what's been new for me, what I've been doing for myself. So not necessarily emphasizing time in the job, but again, think about it in smaller chunks of time. What in the past 5 years have I done in this job, et cetera. So I hope that's helpful.
I think that does address another question that came through. And also, as Lori has said, your job can change over time. Maybe you've been regraded. Maybe there has been some sort of significant change like that. And that in and of itself can almost be like having a new job, even though you haven't moved anywhere, nothing has changed.
Right.
So I don't know. We're not having any more questions coming in at this time. We do have a little more time, so we're going to give you guys just another minute or so, see if anything else comes in, and then if it doesn't, we'll probably wrap up.
Yeah, we're happy to field other questions that come to mind, so send them along. Hello, folks. We've had another question come in, which is a great question. The question is, if you post more than one version of your resume to Aspire, will all versions be seen when applying for a job? The way Aspire works is that your resume is tied to that one job requisition. So one resume, one requisition. So it's very possible that you're going to use different resumes for different requisitions. However, one thing to keep in mind is that it is possible for somebody to see and aspire your candidacy for another position, and they could well see that you've got a different resume in there for that other position. And I think if the resume's been tailored appropriately and it makes sense for that job, they would think all the better. Oh, look at this, you know, she's tailoring the resume. What I want to caution people about is not having too many versions of your resume. It gets very confusing very quickly, not just using Aspire, but just in general. So I say to people, if you've got more than 3 versions of your resume, you really have to be careful that they're not too far afield, that it makes sense given the kinds of jobs that you're applying for, and that you can keep track of them. When we talk about that skill summary as an optional piece of resume, the other advice I give people is instead of doing a tailored skill summary and popping it on different versions of your resume, that can be a really handy tool to use for cover letters. You can drop that tailored skill summary right into a cover letter and pretty much have maybe 1 or 2 versions of your resume that more or less stay the same. So that's another strategy for managing how you want to have different versions of your resume.
So I think we are approaching the end. We did look up, or well, I looked up some of the dates that are coming up. Creating Your Best Resume is on May 7th here at CWD. We also have a Rock Bottom Basics of LinkedIn class if anyone's interested in kind of starting from the basics with LinkedIn and learning about how to use that to promote themselves professionally. That's on May 1st. And also, sort of along the same vein, if anyone is interested, we have Navigating Your Harvard Career happening on May 14th. And also, so you know, our other webinars along the same vein, such as informational interviews and the role of references, are also recorded previously this year and posted up on the Watch and Learn page, right where this presentation will be posted as well. So we want to thank you all for joining us. We really hope you got something useful out of this. I know Lori loved having all of you.
Yes, it was great. And again, try not to beat yourself up over your resume. There's no such thing as a perfect resume. If you go after the perfect resume, you're going to drive yourselves crazy. Just go after a resume that's professional, free of errors, reads well, have people read it, make sure there's plenty of white space on it, and just kind of go with the feedback that you're getting from people. Are they finding information that's helpful? And good luck, everybody. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you. Hope to see you soon.